Hello, 7th graders. This is Mr. Shear, and we are starting a new week-long unit or so on different Native American battles that happened in Washington in the middle of the 1850s, all as a response to this whole treaty reservation-making period. And before we begin, I want to tell you what your assignment is today. Your assignment is to watch this video and fill out the Google form. Or you can come to the Google Meet where I will do the same presentation again, and we can fill out the Google form together. So it's your choice. If you want to continue and do it on your own, continue with this video and fill out the Google form, or you can come to the Google Meet and we'll do it together. And just to let you know, the first part of this video is me talking. I'm going to give you an overview of what happened in some of these battles and some of the people in these battles. And then the second part of this video, it's going to jump into somebody else's video, and that has a little bit more detail about the specific events of some of these conflicts. So these are the conflicts we're talking about over the next week. In 1855, with the reservations being established by Governor Isaac Stevens, this marks the beginning of a series of Native American battles with the territorial Washington government. And you can look through this list here. We got the Yakama War, the Puget Sound War, there's battles in Walla, then you have the Coeur d'Alene War, and finally the Nez Perce War. Today we're going to focus on these three, and we're going to spend 2 days on this first three. So they all happen pretty simultaneously. You have the Yakama War, the Puget Sound War, and the Walla battles. They're all pretty connected and they happen simultaneously, so we're going to treat these as one topic. We'll do part 1 today and part 2 at our next meet. All right, so we'll start with the Yakama War. And it takes place in the summer of 1855 to the spring of 1856. And I'm going to start by telling you some of the key names of people involved. And of course, Yakama is right here, if you can see my cursor, and this is about where the reservation is. It's just north of the modern city of Yakama. Fun fact, we spell Yakama with an I to be truer to the pronunciation. The Native Americans pronounced it with an A sound, so in the middle of the 1990s, like 1994, a lot of the spellings changed Yakama from an I after the K to an A after the K, but they are considered interchangeable words. So the Yakama Reservation is here. It's a larger reservation right in the middle of the state. And the first major player is, again, Washington Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens. And by now, maybe you know that Stevens is the first territorial governor of Washington. And I want to point out that when he became the governor of the territory of Washington in 1853, even from day one, he's got to deal with the Cayuse natives in the Cayuse War that happened because of the Whitman Massacre. So if you remember the Whitman Massacre, the Cayuse natives took 45 or so hostages, and there was a 2-year battle while they held people from the Whitman mission hostage. And that's what Isaac Stevens inherits from day one. He's dealing with Native American conflicts. And in general, Stevens does not have a ton of respect for Native Americans in the territory. His big master plan included making the region safe, and from his point of view, in order to get a railroad built. He wants to entice the railroad companies to come to Washington, because a railroad means a ton more settlers in the area. It also means you can ship the products that we're making to the rest of the country, and it means a lot more money and production for the Washington territory. So his big goal is to make the region safe. He thinks in order to do that, he needs to put Native Americans on reservations. Another thing I want to point out is that Isaac Stevens is actually gone for many of these conflicts because he's got to go, as I mentioned in another lesson. Stevens has to travel from Washington Territory, our capital here, Olympia, right where the cursor is, all the way to Washington, D.C. to get funding and to get goods and supplies and funding and money for the Native Americans, which he's promised them in order to move to reservations. So he's often traveling all across the country, either by horseback or by boat, or he's traveling by boat all the way around through the Pacific Ocean, around the tip of South America. But he's often gone for much of this, trying to go back to D.C. to work with Congress and get funding. All right, the next person I want you to know is Chief Kamiunkin, who is the chief in charge of the Yakama Nation. And before the reservation was established, there was no one Yakama tribe per se. The Yakama Nation is actually 14 different tribes put under one reservation, and many of these tribes were enemies. So Chief Kamiunkin is actually appointed by Isaac Stevens to be in charge of these 14 tribes that now make up the Yakama Nation. And at first Kamiunkin's kind of reluctant. He actually doesn't necessarily want to be in charge. And when he's appointed leader of the Yakama Nation, he gives this speech, and I'm just going to read you the whole speech. It's super short, but this gives you an idea of if he wanted the job of chief. Kamiunkin says, "The forest knows me. He knows my heart. He knows I do not desire a great many goods. All that I wish for is a government agent, a good agent, who will pity the good and bad of us and take care of us. I have nothing to talk long about. I am tired. I am anxious to get back to my garden. That is all I have to say." Well, if he didn't want to be chief, he turns out to be a really good one. He is humble and at first a reluctant leader, but he proves to be very smart militarily. He proves to be somebody who is able to unite these 14 tribes under one leadership, and he proves to be a very capable chief. All right, the next person I want to tell you about is Andrew Bolton. So we got Isaac Stevens, Chief Kamiunkin, and Andrew Bolton. And Bolton is not a very important figure, but his death is important because his death kicks off the Yakama War. And Bolton's job was he worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And in 1855, he went to the Yakama Reservation to investigate the murder of 2 settlers. So again, sorry about that. So again, the Yakama Nation is here by modern-day Yakama, and they have a reservation, and they were promised that white people would not be able to settle on their reservation. But in the summer of 1855, gold is found in the Cascades here, in the foothills of the Cascades. Gold is found. And so, of course, people come to find gold, and prospectors and white settlers come into the Yakama territory to find gold. And the Yakama appeal to Olympia, to Isaac Stevens, and they ask him to please keep people out of the territory, but it's really hard to enforce reservation boundaries. Well, eventually two white prospectors travel onto the reservation looking for gold. They end up raping and murdering a Native American woman, and in response, Yakama natives, including Kamiunkin's nephew, kill the 2 white settlers. Well, Andrew Bolton is called in. He's sent to investigate the murder on the Yakama Nation of these 2 white settlers, and instead he gets killed. And this sets off the Yakama War. And the Yakama natives, actually, after Bolton gets killed, they actually figure out, the Native Americans do, which brave killed Bolton, which Indian killed Bolton. They bring that Native American to Olympia to turn him in, but it doesn't matter. The settlers in the Washington Territory are angry, tensions build, and it eventually leads to war. Well, this man is the last person I want you to know that the video will talk about. His name is General John E. Wool. And Wool is the general who is going to be sent in by Stevens to end the Yakama and Puget Sound Wars. However, he's actually sympathetic to the Native Americans, and he believes that Isaac Stevens and other white people are the ones to blame for the conflicts. He thinks the reservations are wrong. He thinks that we're picking fights with Native Americans, and he's often at odds with Governor Isaac Stevens. All right, second thing I want to tell you about is the Puget Sound War. So you got the Yakama Nation, and the Yakama Wars kicked off. Now you got the Puget Sound War. And again, Governor Stevens plays a role. And just fun fact, Lake Stevens, just south of Conway, is named after Governor Isaac Stevens. So the big new character in the Puget Sound War is Chief Leschi of the Nisqually tribe. And he's another strong military leader, and he has an ability as well to unite other tribes to his cause. And the Nisqually Valley is just south of Seattle, near Tacoma in South Seattle. And his people live throughout the South Seattle region. Now, they're fairly migratory. And Leschi is a half Yakama Native American, and he's frustrated by the Yakama tribal war, and he basically starts his own war with the territorial government. His main issue is about the loss of fishing rights for his people. So he's put on a reservation, and he actually feels like what's true, that white people keep fishing in the areas that have been designated for his tribe. Again, conflict leads to war, and this one's called the Puget Sound War. Back to that. And the Puget Sound War is all throughout this area. There'll eventually be a Battle of Seattle, but it's all throughout the Seattle, Tacoma, area here. And fun fact about Nisqually Tribal Chief Leschi, there's a lot named after him now. In Seattle, there's a whole neighborhood called the Leschi neighborhood. There are 2 schools. There's a high school in Seattle, one in Puyallup. There's 5 different major streets named after him, and there's a Leschi Park also in Seattle. So you got the Yakama War here in Yakama, and then you have the Puget Sound War here near Seattle and Tacoma. And then lastly, the video is going to talk about the Walla battles. And a new character in the whole story is Oregon Territorial Governor George Law Curry. And Governor Curry does not like General Wool's peaceful approach to the Native American conflicts, so he orders an attack on the Umatilla tribe, who were not involved in any of these conflicts. So Curry is the Oregon governor. He's Isaac Stevens' counterpart, but in Oregon, he orders an attack on what is basically a random tribe. Now, the Umatilla get attacked by the federal government, really, again, not for very good reasons. And other tribes like the Cayuse and the Walla join in order to help defend the Umatilla. And then Yellowbird orders an attack on Fort Walla in retaliation for the attack on the Umatilla. So again, Curry's the territorial governor. He attacks the Umatilla tribe, which is right down here in Oregon, just under Walla. Other tribes, including the Cayuse and the Walla, led by Chief Yellowbird, then decide to defend the Umatilla, and as a retaliation, Yellowbird orders that the Walla tribe and the other tribes he unites attack Fort Walla. He attacks a U.S. fort. Well, after he attacks the fort, Yellowbird decides that there's just too much bloodshed. He feels the Umatilla were attacked. He's now retaliated, and he decides that he's going to turn himself in order to be a hostage for the federal government, so that his people will negotiate for peace and that they can go back to being peaceful. I think he felt something like, it's even. You attacked the Umatilla for no reason. We attacked your fort for no reason. We're even. Let's just have peace. However, he is later found murdered. Yellowbird is, and that just incites more violence in the Walla region. So last few takeaways of this whole thing that I haven't discussed much, but from summer of 1855 to the spring of 1856, you have these 3 wars that break out: the Yakama, Puget Sound, and the Walla regions. The Native Americans go on to win every major battle, and the second part of this video will describe that. Every one of the first major conflicts of the United States versus Native Americans, for about 6 months, the Native Americans dominate. Governor Stevens is gone for much of these actual events. And then remember, John E. Wool is the general in charge of putting down the Native American uprisings. However, he's actually sympathetic to the Native Americans and thinks they're being treated badly. On the other hand, he's at odds with both the territorial governors, Isaac Stevens and Curry from Oregon, who both want all hostile natives killed or captured. With that, I'm going to jump into the second half of this video, which is somebody else describing in greater detail these three events.
By the time the Umatilla Reservation had been created to end the Cayuse War, the territory of Washington had been around 2 full years. The territory was run by Governor Isaac Stevens. This guy was brutal to Native Americans within the territory's borders. In an attempt to establish U.S. political dominance with the new Washington Territory, Governor Stevens made it a point to reach out to all major Native American tribes in his borders and enforce the sovereignty of the U.S. territory over the tribes. To do this, he brokered and sometimes forced or threatened tribes into treaties where natives would give up all of their land in return for reservations, right to fisheries, land that couldn't be settled by whites, and agencies where payments and provisions would be paid to the tribes. In Season 2 of Two Wheels, One Compass, we saw how the Minnesotan government did the same thing to the Dakota tribe, and it did not turn out well. The worst part about Governor Stevens' treaties is that they were very hard to enforce. Washington State was very far from Washington, D.C. Communication to vote or ratify treaties was slow, and actually setting up agencies to dole out provisions and payments to the natives was even slower. Many promises he made were difficult or even impossible to keep. One such example was the case of the Yakama Native tribes in the center of the territory. Right after the Cayuse War ended in 1855, Governor Stevens made an agreement for the Yakama tribe to cede some 6 million acres in exchange for $200,000 and a reservation where no white man could settle nor enter. The issue with this was Stevens couldn't enforce this agreement, and it had to be ratified in Washington, D.C. Stevens was actually in Washington, D.C. trying to get the Senate to ratify the treaty when tensions in his territory came to a boiling point. Just as it was in the Great Sioux War, gold was discovered, bringing prospectors to the Yakama tribal territory, where the proverbial fuse was lit on the powder keg. 2 white prospectors raped a Yakama woman on the reservation, leading tribal leaders Kamiakin's nephew to murder them in return. A Bureau of Indian Affairs agent, Andrew Bolton, departed on horseback to investigate the murders of the prospectors. Upon reaching the reservation, Yakama natives told Bolton it was not safe and he should be escorted out. Before leaving, a fight broke out between the Yakama escorts over the fate of Bolton, and he ended up being stabbed to death. In an effort to end the escalating violence, the Yakama sent a messenger to Fort Dalles, formerly Fort Lee, to tell them who had committed the murders so that they may stand trial for the murder and end all hostilities. Once the word was sent, however, panic ensued across the territories that an uprising was in progress. The same news spread across the native tribes of the region, emboldening them and rallying them under one leader, Kamiakin. The Oregon and Washington territories mustered troops, and the tribes under Kamiakin rallied for battle. This led to the Yakama War. Major Granville O. Haller and 84 infantry set out from Fort Dalles into Yakama territory and was met by some 300 Yakama warriors. The first engagement of the Yakama War was the Battle of Toppenish Creek, which was a huge loss for the U.S. military. They were forced to retreat, resulting in a Yakama victory. The territorial governments panicked and mustered forces that crossed from Fort Dalles into the Washington Territory. They would eventually take on the Yakama under Kamiakin head-on. To the northwest, another war was brewing. Leshai, an Nisqually chief who was half Yakama, was going around to the native tribes of the Puget Sound area, recruiting warriors to bring battle to the doorstep of the territorial government. Governor Isaac Stevens had also pushed the Nisqually into a treaty. It gave them fishing rights but took away all of their farmland. 2.24 million acres were taken, and the Nisqually were put onto useless, rough, and rocky reservations that were basically land that whites didn't want. Leshai was the chief who was in charge of negotiating for the natives in the Puget Sound area. After hearing of the Yakama uprising at the Battle of Toppenish Creek, he recruited some 150 warriors of neighboring tribes. In response, a small regiment of 18 volunteer dragoons were mustered to arrest Leshai. The dragoons were discovered on the White River. Leshai and his warriors attacked them, pushing the dragoons to hide in a cabin for defensive cover for 4 days before they could escape. Leshai's warriors then raided several settlers' cabins along the White River, and they killed 9 civilians. The civilians had been told by neutral natives to flee, but they didn't leave. Until his death, Leshai claimed that he did everything he could to stop the massacre along the White River. While this was going on, 243 U.S. soldiers were attempting to cross the Natchez Pass and enter the Yakama homeland from the rear. The snow was too thick, and they'd gone around and attempted to cross at the White River. Leshai's forces were spotted, and the U.S. made an attempt to cross. They were unable to advance due to native sharpshooters, and they waited until the next day to make another attempt. Leshai's warriors fell back to the Green River and celebrated, only to be attacked again by U.S. soldiers. The attack was unsuccessful, and there were only casualties on the U.S. side. The soldiers ended up falling back, marking a victory for Leshai at the Battle of White River. Days later, the force that had been mustered by both Oregon and Washington's territorial governments attacked a defensive barrier put up by Kamiakin with artillery. For the next few days, the U.S. would advance on Kamiakin only to be attacked by natives using hit-and-run tactics, using geographical barriers such as forests and rivers the whole way. This tired and angered the soldiers, who were gaining casualties left and right. These failed series of attacks were called the Battle of Union Gap. Only one of Kamiakin's soldiers died during the attacks. Frustrated with winter approaching, the U.S. forces returned to Fort Dalles. Later in the month of November, U.S. soldiers returned to the White River Valley, where the Battle of White River had occurred, and ran into natives again. There were several casualties on both sides, but no outcome. Camping nearby, the U.S. troops were fired upon, killing several troops, including a lieutenant that was leading them. The battle was known as the Skirmish at Brennan's Prairie. So far, Kamiakin and the Central Washington Native tribes were on the defensive, but winning every battle. The Washington and Oregon territorial governments were unsure what to do next. A general by the name of John E. Wool arrived from California and stationed himself at Fort Vancouver. He wasn't very popular because he blamed much of the conflict that was occurring in the territories on the fault of the whites. His plan to move the Yakama and Puget Sound wars forward was to arm the militia in settlements close to hostile native areas and have the army stationed in areas natives were known to hunt. They would occupy traditional hunting grounds and fishing grounds, starving the Yakama into surrender. The governor down in the territory of Oregon had a different idea. Governor George Law Curry had taken a force of U.S. soldiers and decided to launch a preemptive and largely unprovoked attack against the eastern tribes of the Walla, Palouse, Umatilla, and Cayuse, who had up until that point remained cautiously neutral in the conflict. The eastern tribes were now involved, causing the Walla Valley to become yet another native hotspot. The Walla leader Yellowbird responded by attacking Fort Walla. In response, the Oregonian territory sent 350 soldiers to the abandoned fort and set out to punish the Walla. Yellowbird, who believed it was an appropriate response to the attack on their reservation, met under the white flag of truce and offered himself up as a hostage to end hostilities and create a ceasefire. Other neighboring Cayuse and other tribes heard of the unprovoked attack on the Umatilla reservation and decided to take it a step further. 1,000 warriors from the Cayuse, Palouse, and Walla tribes descended down on the soldiers. The Battle of Walla was the longest battle in Washington history. For 4 days, the eastern tribesmen battled the soldiers until the soldiers had run out of supplies and had to retreat. Yellowbird was later found beheaded, dismembered, and scalped as a result of the broken ceasefire. The governor of the territory of Washington, Governor Stevens, had just arrived from Washington, D.C. to a territory embroiled in chaos. Because Curry's unprovoked attack against the Umatilla reservation had cut off much communication down the Oregon Trail, Stevens had to sneak his way across the Walla Valley. He was furious he had to do so, and he blamed General Wool for it, while also chastising him for his current tactics against the natives. Both governors Curry and Stevens called for Wool's resignation. The winter slowed the conflict for a time, but it would only be another month before natives and whites would clash again.